Timberline, Oregon wore the storm like a shroud the night 10-year-old Emily Carter slipped off the porch with a trembling flashlight and a promise to find the family cat. The beam caught a boot first, then a badge, then a man face down in the drifts. Officer Mark Dawson, his wrists cut by rope and his breath a thin rattle. A German shepherd lay over him the way a blanket lies over a child. Above them, a knife pinned a paper to a cedar, "Keep quiet." Emily's shed became a field hospital, her scarf a tourniquet, her courage a fuse. By morning, there would be a hidden USB forest road maps and a ranger station that wasn't what it seemed. By night, a friendly knock would carry the wrong smile. If a small voice can hold back a blizzard, what happens when the wind changes? Like and subscribe to follow every step into the snow. The storm had settled over Timberline like an old memory, the kind that dulls the world to quiet and makes every sound feel borrowed. Emily Carter pressed her mittened hands beneath her coat and stepped from the porch into snow that came to her shins, the beam of a cheap flashlight shivering in the wind. Her mother was asleep on the couch inside a blanket pulled to her chin and the space heater ticking like a metronome. Whiskers, the family cat, had slipped out at dusk and never scratched to be let back in. Emily told herself this was a simple rescue, a 10-year-old's bravado disguised as kindness. The snow told her otherwise, needling her cheeks, flattening the pine boughs, swallowing the path she thought she knew in daylight. She followed the fence line, then the cut of the old logging road where the drifts formed into low dunes. Timberline's houses were far apart up here. Porch lights were small planets glowing in mist. The mountain breathed a steady hush, and within it, Emily heard a sound so faint she thought it belonged to the wind, a thin, urgent whine. She killed the flashlight and held her breath. The whine came again, closer this time, then broke into a cough of a bark, not loud but purposeful, as if a voice trying not to wake the world. She moved toward it, counting her steps like in gym class, 1, 2, 3, each footfall a soft crunch. The trees rose around her like black ribs, and the road fell away into a trace of game trail she knew from summers, a slash of rabbit runs and deer prints. The bark came again, and now there was the shape of it, fear and insistence folded together. Emily dipped her shoulder under a low branch, stumbled over a buried root, and the flashlight beam skated across a skitter of ice, then a dark arc in the snow. She almost stepped on a glove, a heavy-duty black glove with the kind of textured palm her mother used to scrub oven racks. She picked it up. It was warm, only on the side that had been pressed to the ground, cold on top, as if it had been dropped not long ago. The bark cut off. There came a sound she would remember later in dreams, a dog's low rumble that wasn't for her. She dropped to a crouch and slid forward the way she'd seen kids do in the schoolyard. Palms opened the flashlight, tilted away to keep from glaring into eyes. That was when she saw him. At first, only the stick-out angles of a boot and a shoulder under a frosting of ice. Then the whole of him where the snow had thinned. A man in a dark jacket face turned to the side, a smear of red frozen at his temple. Hands bound behind him so tight, the rope had cut a neat groove through his sleeves. Across his chest, a German shepherd had draped himself as if he'd decided his body was the last blanket left in the world. The dog's coat was matted with ice crystals. One ear nicked his sides, working hard, but his head lifted when Emily's breath fogged the air. He didn't bark. He didn't show his teeth. He only watched eyes the color of banked coals, then shifted his weight enough for her to see that the man's badge loosened from a clipped pocket, hung sideways on a chain. "Officer," she whispered without meaning to. "Hey, boy." And the dog's ear twitched. "It's okay. I won't hurt him." The rope was not like anything she'd tied in Scouts. It was thinner, waxy, knotted with a speed that felt practiced. Emily's stomach tightened. She touched the man's cheek with the back of her glove the way her mother did to check a fever. His skin was like the metal swing at school in January. "Sir," she whispered, "can you hear me?" The dog pressed his nose into the man's neck, puffing steam, then flicked a glance at Emily as if she'd been invited to participate in a vow. The flashlight found a smear in the snow nearby, brown-black where blood had clotted. Then a scuffed patch, as if someone had tried to drag another body and failed. A paper shape hung from a low cedar branch pinned by a knife whose handle gleamed under frost. Emily didn't want to read it. She read it anyway. 2 words in block letters: "Keep quiet." Her heart kicked. She stepped closer to the man and listened. His breath was shallow, a thin whistle, but it existed and that mattered more than anything. She remembered the old wool horse blanket in their shed and the way her mother swore that heat disappears quicker from the ground than the air. "I need to get you both out of this," she said, and the dog tilted his head at the word both. "Are you Shadow?" She tried tasting the name like she'd just invented it, and the dog's tail thumped once against the man's coat. It felt like permission. She slid her flashlight under her chin, tugged at the rope, then stopped. She didn't know what tricks that knot might be hiding, if cutting it would loosen or tighten if the men who did this were watching to see who came for their prey. The night felt taller. A gust pushed needles against her sleeves. From a long way off came the hollow thud of something metal, maybe a plow blade, maybe a truck bed. Emily swallowed. She put her hands on the dog's shoulders, the fur coarse and damp beneath her gloves. "I'm going to get help," she whispered. "I promise." The dog's eyes flicked to the trees, then back to her, and there was trust there, or something like it. A bargain between 2 creatures who both understood cold. She pulled off her scarf-striped wool, faded at the ends, and slid it under the man's neck to lift his face an inch above the snow. The dog adjusted too, keeping his chest pressed against the man's ribs. "Good boy," Emily said, and the dog's breath came a little steadier, like the words were a hand smoothing a blanket. Emily fumbled in her coat for the emergency whistle her mother made her carry. She didn't blow it. The woods were wrong for a whistle tonight. Sound would carry in ways she couldn't control. She touched the man's shoulder again. His eyelids fluttered. "Mark." He breathed almost nothing of a word more frost than sound. "Mark Dawson," he said a heartbeat later, and Emily felt the name take shape in the air, heavy with meaning. Shadow. The dog's tail beat once more. "Don't trust." The rest dissolved as his throat worked, then stilled into shallow rhythm. Emily looked back down the trail toward home. The porch light was a blur lost in the whitening world. She swung the flashlight to the cedar and saw the knife handle again. The grain scuffed the blade a dull shadow under rime. "Keep quiet." She thought of her mother's phone on the kitchen counter, a hairline crack across the screen where it had slipped into the sink last month. The landline had gone out 2 storms ago, and the radio her mother used to check road closures had sputtered and died after coughing a burnt wiring smell. In town, the police station's brick facade always looked solid to her like a bookend. Now the word officer did not feel like a guarantee. A low plane of fear moved through her, not a shriek, but the kind of fear that asks you to take one step and then another. She slipped the glove she'd found into her pocket, more evidence than warmth, and studied the rope again. The knot was tight but not impossible. She eased the rope where it bit at the wrist bone, tested the give. The dog lifted his paw and set it on the man's sleeve as if to say, "Careful." "Okay," she whispered. Shed first, then blankets, then heat. A plan was a rope of its own, something to grip in the dark. "I'll come right back." She pushed to her feet. The dog stood too wobbling, then steadied his stance over the man, his body angled toward the cedars like a door set against a draft. "Shadow," she said, more certain now. "Guard." The word seemed to be one he knew. He lowered his head and went quiet alert, a soldier in fur. Emily took 3 steps, and the cold found the strip of skin between her hat and scarf, and she understood in a different way how close this was to being too late. She turned once catalogued what mattered: the badge on the chain, the knife in the cedar, the glove in her pocket, the way the dog leaned into the man's heartbeat, as if that was the only furnace left. She ran. The snow tried to hold her, but she was small and fast, and fear is a kind of fire when it chooses to help you. At the fence line, she glanced back. The cedar swayed, the paper clacked, and beyond them both the dog's eyes caught her flashlight and reflected 2 small moons. She nodded to them. A promise blinked across distance, then shouldered through the gate and made for the shed where a wool horse blanket waited in a dusty trunk and beside it a thermos, her mother filled with ginger tea every winter. The wind pushed the dark, listened, and Emily ran the rest of the way as if the world had given her only this task and this night, to learn who she was when it counted. Emily shouldered through the drifting snow with the wool blanket and the dented thermos clutched to her chest. The shed's door ahead of her. A dark rectangle framed by frost and shadow limped at her side, because he refused to stay behind with Officer Mark lying helpless under the cedar. She nudged the door with her hip, slipped inside, pulled the cord to wake the dim bulb, and spread the blanket across the ribbed rubber mat where her mother kept tools. The dog lowered himself only when she tapped the center and said quietly, "Down, Shadow." And even then his eyes stayed fixed on the night. She unscrewed the thermos, poured a little steaming ginger water into a dented basin, dipped a clean shop towel, and cupped his muzzle to wipe the hard ice from his whiskers and nose. He trembled with exhaustion, yet held still, accepting the warmth like a good soldier who knew rest was part of the job. She rubbed his chest with a faded beach towel, watched his breath even out, and then cracked the door again because Mark still lay where the wind could take him. Shadow heaved himself up and pressed forward as if to guide her back. Emily crouched beside Mark, slid the blanket under his shoulders, rocked him carefully until his face rose an inch above the snow, then drew him in a slow pull toward the shed, while Shadow backed with them, keeping his body draped across Mark's ribs to hold heat where it mattered most. Inside, she set the officer on the mat, latched the door, and angled the small propane heater so its breath rolled across wool and not flame. She loosened his boots, lifted his tied wrists onto a folded rag to keep the rope from cutting deeper, and pressed the warm towel to his cold hands and the dried crescent at his temple. The shed smelled of cedar shavings, oil, and ginger, a homey mixture that steadied her hands. She brought a camp cup to Mark's lips, let 2 slow sips touch his mouth, and counted to 5, like the poster at school had taught her for shock. Shadow lay parallel to him, flank touching arm, head up and ears pointed toward the seam of the door. When the wind pushed a branch somewhere outside, a low growl rose from his chest. Not angry, simply certain that danger should not be allowed to enter. Emily studied the knots biting into Mark's sleeves and found the short tail she had noticed earlier. She eased it a fraction, tested the give, and stopped telling herself to warm first and cut later so the blood would not rush and make him faint. She tucked the ends of the blanket under his sides the way her mother trapped heat on their couch during outages, then leaned close and said, "Sir, I'm Emily Carter, and you're safe here because sometimes names made a room feel held together." Mark's eyelids fluttered like something returning from far away. His mouth worked, and a faint breath carried a word into the warmed air. Delaney barely sound at all, just a shape that made the dog's head snap toward him. Shadow barked once, sharp and controlled, then stared at the door as if he expected that name to arrive wearing boots. Emily startled so hard the cup rattled, and she realized the dog's reaction belonged to recognition, not habit. "Frank Delaney." She whispered, her voice unsure because the lieutenant shook hands at holiday parades. Mark swallowed, pulled in a thin breath, and murmured, "Do not trust," before slipping back into shallow sleep. The heater ticked. The bulb hummed. Shadow's gaze never left the seam of night around the doorframe, and his body blocked a strip of cold air that leaked through the boards as if he had chosen to be a wall. Emily took the black glove from her pocket and set it on a shelf where she could see it, a marker that she was not imagining the trail. She thought about the knife pinning "Keep Quiet" to the cedar and felt the world tilt another degree toward caution. She refilled the cup, gave Mark 2 more sips, and then slid behind his shoulders to brace him more upright so his lungs had less weight to fight. She checked his pulse at the wrist and found it steadier than before, which made her breathe easier. Shadow's paw crept forward until it rested on Mark's sleeve, and the gesture felt like a promise that the dog intended to keep, so Emily let her hand rest on that paw for a second, because promises sometimes needed witnesses. Wind sighed across the roof. A distant engine coughed and fell silent. Shadow answered with another low rumble, and Emily said softly, "I hear it," to show she would not ignore what he offered. She tugged the chain to kill the bulb so the shed looked like any other dark shape to anyone passing by, then settled with her back against the door, one knee against the blanket's edge, the camp cup balanced in her hand. She planned without drama. Keep the heater safe. Watch his breathing, wait for the sky to lift, and then take the fire trail to Grace Miller's place, because Grace knew wounds carried quiet like a skill and trusted Emily enough to come without questions. She rehearsed the route in her head, the birch snag that looked like a question mark, the fallen rail, the shallow creek, so she could guide even if morning came gray. Mark slept in small swallows of air. The dog kept the seam. The shed held its breath with them. Emily whispered, "We will make it to morning," and felt how the words settled the room. She checked the rope one last time, confirmed the rag prevented chafing, and angled the heater a notch lower to stretch the fuel. When the wind lifted again and then eased, the dog's eyes softened but did not close, and Emily let the rhythm of 2 heartbeats persuade her to wait. Dawn would come. She would go for Grace. And whatever the name Delaney meant, they would face it with warmth in their hands instead of snow. She listened for morning, held her plan steady, and promised the room they would walk toward help as soon as light returned. The gray of morning sat low on the trees when Emily eased the shed door a finger's width and let the cold slip across her cheek. Inside, the propane heater hummed softly. Officer Mark breathed in small, even pulls, and Shadow kept his chin on Mark's sleeve as if that single point of contact kept the world aligned. Grace checked the pulse oximeter, tilted her head in a brief approving nod, and murmured, "We're buying him time," before pointing 2 fingers to her own eyes and then to the yard, a silent question about what waited beyond the boards. Emily pulled on her mother's oversized parka, zipped it to her chin, and stepped out with care, letting the door settle without a sound. The snow had crusted in the night and now gave under her boots with a dry whisper. She took 2 steps and saw them prints wider and longer than any shoe in their house, stamped in a slow arc from the trees to the shed, and then toward the back porch, each heel deep, as if the weight behind it was certain. Not hurried, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who believed no one would challenge him here. She crouched and held her palm beside one, measuring like her science teacher taught her in the nature unit, and she could have fit her hand twice across the ball of the print. The tread showed a broken chevron pattern, the sort her mother's winter boots did not own. Emily followed the line, counting the prints out of habit, 1, 2, 3. Paused and saw where the walker had stopped by the shed window, angled his toes toward the glass, and then stood long enough for the crust to glaze around the edges. A climb of worry moved up her spine as she pictured a shadow in their yard, listening to the heater breathing their air. She moved along the track to the porch, where the boards held a fan of frost, and the prince climbed the 2 steps, and then vanished at the edge of the mat, as if the visitor had stood with his weight on his toes to peer inside. She knelt to study the place where the pattern ended, brushed a sleeve across the brittle powder, and her glove touched metal cold as creekstone. She pinched it up between thumb and forefinger and saw a brass cylinder with the mouth blackened, a spent casing that had rolled against the riser, and waited for her to find it. The find brought silence down hard. The idea of a loaded night did not belong to their porch, yet here it was in her palm. She held still and listened, and heard only the delicate tick of ice finding places to let go. A foot to the left, something gray lay half pressed into the drift. Emily sifted snow away and uncovered a torn triangle of synthetic fabric with a blue thread line and a sliver of rubber at the edge that once had been a glove's fingertip, the textured kind she had seen at the police tent at the county fair. The casing and the glove piece together made a picture she did not want but could no longer refuse. Someone trained had stood here last night and watched the house while she sat 3 boards away holding a cup to Mark's lips. She looked back toward the trees and measured distance, then slipped both items into the parka's inside pocket, deciding to show Grace first and then hide them where the day could not steal them. She followed the prints past the corner of the porch and saw where they turned toward the road, then doubled back and faded into the tree line the return steps placed inside the outgoing ones to confuse any quick glance. That detail told her the visitor had not been careless. Shadow's bark sounded once from inside the shed, not alarmed but clipped in the way he used to mark significant changes, and Emily answered aloud, "I see it too," to anchor herself. Then she came back to the door and slipped inside. Grace looked up, read the set of Emily's shoulders, and waited for the words. Emily placed the casing and the glove piece on a clean lid from an old paint can, and she said, "He stood right there by the window, and then on the porch," and Grace's eyes narrowed the way they did when she traced an injured animal's path through brush. Grace took a penlight, examined the casing without touching the primer, and said quietly, 9mm most likely. Keep prints if any, and she wrapped both items in a strip of brown paper torn from a feed sack. Shadow lifted his head, sniffed once, and let out a small huff, his gaze moving to Mark and then to the door, a tidy line from protection to perimeter. "This means he may come back," Grace said, not to scare but to plan, and Emily nodded, feeling the plan draw itself quickly across the morning. No lights that spill at night, no noise that announces a move to the barn when the day flattens, footprints a call from the far valley. Mark stirred and murmured, and Emily knelt, bringing warmth from the thermos to his lips in 2 careful sips. When he swallowed and opened his eyes a sliver, she said, "You're safe," and he whispered, window the word a string between his dream and her porch. Grace checked the heater and added a caution. "We leave nothing out here. We set decoys, and she asked Emily to bring the broken sled from the lean-to, the one with the splitting runner. They would drag it back and forth to the creek bend to lay a set of prints that would go nowhere and keep a watcher guessing." Emily liked the feel of doing so. She ran to the lean-to, yanked the sled free, and traced a short, busy pathway that suggested a household of restless chores. When she returned, Shadow met her at the door and pushed his shoulder gently against her leg as if to mark her as part of his unit. Grace tucked the evidence into a metal tin she had cleaned for herbs, snapped it shut, and slipped it into the small medical kit that never left her person. "We pack in 10 minutes, Grace said, and Emily heard in that simple sentence the hinge that would swing them from hiding to moving. Shadow stood and tested his weight, favoring one leg, but ready, and Emily gathered the straps, the second blanket, and the small pillow for Mark's head. She slid the parka's zipper higher, tapped the pocket where the USB tube rested, and said softly to Grace, "I'll carry this," and Grace agreed, because a child looked like a child, even when she carried truth. Outside, the light brightened toward noon. The snow took on that flat tone, skiers-like for reading terrain, and the tracks by the porch remained as they had been, clear enough to warn soon to soften. Inside, the 3 of them moved with purpose, their roles clean. Grace tended, Emily prepared, Shadow guarded. By the time Emily tied the last strap on the sled and checked the runner's wax, she felt the next step waiting in the doorway like a held breath, and she understood that the visitor's footprints had given them more than fear. They had given them the exact hour to go. Morning hardened into a clear, pale cold that made every sound ring, and as Grace tightened the last strap on the sled and checked the heater's fuel. Shadow rose from Mark's side, shouldered the shed door with his muzzle, and gave one sharp bark that meant attention rather than alarm. So Emily zipped her parka, slipped outside, and followed him along the fence where the drifts curled like frozen waves. The dog moved with a limp that had purpose, nose-low breath. Steaming tail held level as if he were drawing a line through the yard, and then he veered toward the tree line threaded between two saplings, and halted over a set of boot prints that looked as if they had been pressed not an hour earlier. Edges clean tread, chevrons sharp stride, deliberate toe angle identical from step to step, the kind of regularity that belonged more to training than to wandering. Emily crouched, measured the length with her mitten from heel to toe, and felt how much larger it was than her own. How much weight had sunk it, and Shadow confirmed the freshness by chuffing twice and tracing the outbound path with quick, precise sniffs, then pivoting to point his muzzle toward the shed as if to sketch a map in the air. And Emily saw how the tracks had come close to the north wall, paused, and then paralleled the siding before peeling off toward the birches. She focused on details she had not seen earlier, the faint scuff where someone had rocked back on heels to listen the partial print of a different sole that overlapped once and then vanished as if a second person had stepped carefully into the first one's trail, and she said softly, "Two," and Shadow flicked an ear as if to acknowledge the count. They followed the outbound line to the edge of the service road where a snowplow's rough pass had muddied the story, then circled back on a diagonal that let the light rake the surface and reveal additional signs. A broken twig with a clean green bite, a scuff of salt crystals likely dropped from a boot after time on a road, and the faint chemical tang in the air that reminded Emily of the mechanic's garage where her mother bought windshield fluid. Shadow sneezed, once shook his head and angled for home, speeding up as they approached the yard as if he had saved the most important piece for last, and he cut straight to the back steps, halted, and pressed his nose along the lower edge of the siding beneath the kitchen window, huffing, then pawing, then stopping to sniff again with small, deliberate pulls. He made a short, urgent whine, looked at Emily, and began scraping away a crusted lip of wind-packed snow where the night had drifted it into a neat shelf, and 3 strokes later the edge collapsed and a dull brass cylinder rolled free, kissed by light, followed by a curled scrap of blue-gray fabric textured with rubber nubs and frayed along one seam, and Emily picked both up, keeping them in her mitten like a bowl so prints would not smear, and the weight of the casing, so small and certain, made the porch feel suddenly too near the shed's warm breath. Grace stepped out at Shadow's bark, read the tableau at a glance, and kept her voice level for Emily's sake. Good finds both, and she held open a clean evidence envelope from her kit, letting Emily tip the items in without touch. Then she sealed the flap and labeled it with a pencil from behind her ear. Shadow stood tall ears forward, then lowered his head to Mark's scent that drifted from the cracked door, as if to reassure himself he had guarded 2 fronts in one morning. Emily traced the track of toes on the mat with her eyes, and at last understood how close the watcher had been, not only to the house, but to the place where she had sat through the night counting breaths. She set a hand on the siding, felt the cold sink through her glove, and said quietly, "He stood here long enough to let the snow glue around his boots, and Shadow's tail made a single stiff sweep. A dog's way of agreeing that the past hour still clung to the boards." Grace's plan sharpened in response to the evidence they would move Mark as soon as the sun climbed high enough to flatten shadows across the back trail and soften edges of their passing. They would pull a decoy path toward the creek bend and back to suggest chores and not flight, and they would leave a scatter of broken runner marks near the road to make anyone following wonder if the sled had failed buying them an hour they would need on the timber cut. While Grace spoke, Emily listened with the focus she used to memorize spelling lists, committing each step to the steady file in her mind. Shadow nosed the sled, checked the straps with a nudge, and then sat against Emily's shin as if volunteering for whatever came next. Mark stirred at the doorway, and Emily slipped inside to give him 2 careful sips of warm tea while she said, We found where he stood, and the officer's gaze cleared a fraction and landed on Shadow, whose ears softened when Mark breathed "good dog" in a tired whisper that still had shape and something in the room aligned. They used the next minutes to stage the yard the way Grace would prepare a release site for a rehabilitated animal, familiar but misleading edges, scuffed straight lines broken, nothing neat enough to read easily. When Emily finished dragging the broken sled in a looping pattern that crossed itself twice and ended in a churn near the gate, she looked up at the sun whitening the sky and saw that the light had settled into that paper-flat angle. Skiers' love for reading terrain, perfect for their departure. Shadow stood, shook once, tested his weight, and took his spot at the sled's shoulder, prepared to range outward for scent, while Grace and Emily lifted Mark onto the padded plank and cinched the straps so fabric would support without pinching. Emily touched the pocket where the tiny USB rested in its specimen tube, then slipped the sealed envelope with the casing and glove scrap into Grace's inner coat and said, "We keep both truths." And Grace smiled with more resolve than warmth and answered, "We do," as the three of them turned to the tree line that led to the barn clinic and the longer plan that waited there. The back trail took them to Grace's barn clinic just as the light flattened over the ridge, and Emily felt relief when the side door lifted and turned without groaning because she had remembered to lift as she twisted. Inside, the air smelled of pine shavings, antiseptic, and hay, warmed by a small, radiant heater. And Grace guided the sled to a padded table while Shadow ranged the perimeter with his nose low, checking corners and vents before he settled by Mark's side as if the barn itself had to earn his trust. Grace set a laptop on a metal cart, wiped her hands, and asked for the specimen tube, and Emily unzipped her inner pocket and passed it over like a relay baton, then stood with her palm pressed to Mark's sleeve while Grace peeled the tape from the tiny USB and slid it into a port. The screen blinked, chimed a thin encrypted tone, and lines of folders appeared with dates, initials, and root codes that looked like someone's private language. Grace exhaled, opened a small program she kept for wildlife tagging data, and ran a basic decode filter because sometimes criminals hid maps the way she hid migration routes, and the laptop emitted a rising tritone, as if something inside it had recognized its own kind. The sound made Shadow lift his head, stiffen, and turn toward the window that faced the old service road. A low growl tightening in his chest as he fixed his eyes on the glass, and Emily felt the room tilt from safe to alert in the space of that single sound. Grace clicked a folder labeled FSR North Permit, and a set of maps populated the screen with thin gray lines for Forest Service roads and blue dots for water sources. Then a series of red triangles that marked waypoints not on any public map. Emily leaned closer, traced one triangle with her finger held just off the glass, and whispered, "That's the ranger station by the ridge," because her mother cleaned it on weekends, and she knew how the afternoon sun fell across its concrete pad. Shadow paced a tight circle, and barked twice toward the window as if to draw a line from the screen to the horizon. Then he trotted to the back door, pawed once, and returned to the window, repeating the pattern, until even Grace said, "He knows that place," with a certainty that surprised her own voice. Emily opened a second file marked Access and found scanned permits with typed names and a signature block that read Lieutenant F. Delaney Timberline PD, and the fact of that signature sitting quiet on the screen made the barn feel smaller. Grace took a photo of the display with a small camera that did not share to any cloud. Then she copied the files to a blank drive from her kit and ejected the original, sliding it back into the specimen tube and into Emily's pocket, because a copy was a plan and custody mattered. The laptop pinged again as if a background process had finished, and Shadow's growl deepened, not loud just enough to mark that the world outside the window had changed again. Emily clicked a tab labeled Schedule, and a simple table showed dates and times with entries that matched nights she remembered seeing trucks move through the valley, and one row glowed with today's date paired with the ranger station and a noon to dusk window. Grace looked at the clock on the barn wall and then at the light outside where the day had already tilted toward late afternoon, and she said, "If they are using that station, they will stage before dark," and she said it like a wildlife forecast, matter-of-fact, measurable. Emily pictured the station's back lot, the locked storage cage, the small radio tower, and the blind corner where a truck could idle unseen. She spoke those details aloud, so Grace could hear the terrain through a child's memory, and Shadow punctuated each point with a quick glance to the window, as if he understood the map in her head. Mark stirred eyelids fluttering, and Emily bent close and said, "We're at Grace's. We found maps," and he breathed. Station like a word that belonged to a sequence he had rehearsed, and Shadow answered with a short, contained bark, then stood with his body angled to the door ready. Grace's plan adjusted on the fly, she would stabilize Mark for 1 more hour, pack the laptop and the duplicate drive lock the barn's exterior door that faced the road, and take the creek path with Emily and Shadow to scout the station's perimeter while keeping the officer here under heat and watch, then call her cousin from the landline in the loft if they found movement because the towers still wavered in storms. Emily checked the sled straps again and tucked a compact first aid roll into her parka. Then she lifted the barn latch a finger's width to test the sound it made and closed it without a click, memorizing the pressure. Shadow moved to the door and waited with a patience that felt like a metronome, eyes fixed on the line of trees as if the route were already drawn between his chest and the ridge. Grace slid the backup drive into a tin and taped it under the cart because leaving a copy behind in a place few would search made sense. Then she looked at Emily and said, "We go in 5 minutes," and the sentence turned the barn from clinic to staging room. Outside, the cold sharpened into that hour when tire noise carries far and footsteps record clean, and inside the 3 of them aligned the way teams do before a run. The woman with the plan, the girl with the local map in her bones, and the dog who remembered something the rest of them only suspected. Grace had just slid the duplicate drive into the taped tin under the cart and told Emily they would leave in 5 minutes for a quiet look at the ranger station when tires crackled on frozen gravel outside the barn, and a door latch snapped with the quick confidence of someone who believed every place was his to step into. So Grace straightened, set her features to the calm she wore with strangers, and motioned Emily to the inner stall while she covered Mark with a clean horse blanket and slipped the heater a notch lower. Shadow flowed off the mat and flattened under the metal table with his head between his paws, but his eyes fixed on the doorway, bright and steady. The side door swung wide, and Lieutenant Frank Delaney filled the frame in a crisp winter jacket with the timberline patch, catching pale light. His smile set to neighborly, his tone pitched to visiting guardian as he called morning miss. Miller making sure folks out this way are doing all right after the storm, and he stepped inside without waiting, tracking the room in a sweep that took in tools. The laptop closed on the cart. The sled leaned clean against a stall in the shape of a body under a blanket on the padded table. Grace answered evenly. Morning lieutenant thawing pipes and tending chores, and she moved between him and the table with the practiced ease of someone who could make a doorway out of herself when she had to. Delaney nodded, let his gaze drift toward the blanket again, and took 2 slow steps closer with a pleasant remark about a downed limb on the service road. But the pleasantry died when he crossed an invisible line because Shadow rose from the floor in one smooth motion, planted himself at Grace's knee, and released a low, contained growl that came from deep enough to vibrate the bolts on the table, the ridge of fur along his spine lifting like wheat in a gust. Delaney stopped the smile tightening by a fraction and said, "Well now, that's a serious dog," while his eyes slid past the blanket's edge where a wrist could have shown if Grace had not folded fabric just so. Mark's breath caught, and Emily, small in the stall's shadow, pressed a palm to the wood to keep herself still. Grace set a hand on Shadow's collar, not to restrain, but to show she belonged to him too, and said, "He keeps coyotes off my hens," which was not a lie, and she held Delaney's gaze long enough to turn the air formal. Delaney's look softened back into the easy mask, yet there was calculation beneath it, and he took a backward half-step as if to respect the dog and the woman who claimed him. He made a slow circle through the open bay, asked about road closures, commented on the plow's late pass, and then said, "If you see anyone stranded, call it in," with a glance toward the dark loft where the landline lived, and the way his eyes touched that corner told Grace he had mapped her habits. He left with a final neighborly nod and the bright sound of a door that shut politely. The tires rolled, paused, and then faded down the service lane toward town. Grace did not move until the sound bled into wind, and then she exhaled, lifted the blanket to check Mark's color, and whispered, "All right," while Shadow trotted to the door, nose close to the crack, drawing air in quick assessing pulls like a technician reading an instrument. Emily stepped from the stall and Shadow brushed past her and out into the yard when Grace cracked the door. Then he cut a tight loop along the barn's drip line, stopped where the gravel met the service lane, and lowered his chest to worry at a ridge of churned mud the tires had left. He pawed, dug, and nosed until a dark scrap came free. A torn square of uniform fabric, tacky with oil and spotted with grit, the kind of maintenance cloth a patrolman kept in a door pocket, and it smelled like cold engine and solvent. Emily took the scrap into her mitten like it was a bird's egg, and Shadow pressed his nose to the rutted edge again and gave a short, certain chuff as if to say the scent matched the man. Grace brought out a paper evidence sleeve from her vest, and Emily slid the cloth inside without touching it, then sealed and labeled it with pencil, because ink balked in this cold. Shadow paced back to the door, paused under the kitchen window that looked into the barn office, and sniffed the sill where a faint smear of the same oil darkened old paint, a quiet signature left by a gloved hand. Grace followed his stare and said, He leaned there and listened, and the sentence tightened their timetable. Emily checked the inner pocket where the original USB sat in its tube and felt the small, real weight of it. She looked at Grace and said, "We should move now." And Grace agreed because Delaney's visit had turned their 5-minute plan into a now or never hour. They worked in clean motions, born of practice. Grace tucked the evidence sleeve into the medical kit that never left her side. Emily zipped the duplicate drive into her second pocket. Shadow returned to Mark and nuzzled his sleeve as if to take attendance before the trip, and Mark opened his eyes enough to see the dog and breathe. Good boy, with a thread of strength that made the room feel possible again. They eased Mark onto the sled, tightened the straps so blanket and body moved as one, and Grace locked the barn's road-facing door while Emily lifted the creekside latch with the silent pressure she had rehearsed. Shadow took point with his head to the wind, picking up what the lane carried, and the three of them slipped into the cut of trees where the path bent toward the ranger station that waited like the next square on a careful board. The creek path carried them along the back of the Carter property, and Grace slowed when Shadow's head lifted to the wind and angled hard toward the house. Emily touched her pocket to feel the small tube with the USB, then whispered, "Mom might be home," and Grace nodded, choosing caution over speed, so they cut under the alders and edged to the mudroom door, where the storm door hung ajar. Inside, Laura Carter stood by the sink with a dish towel in her hands, while Lieutenant Delaney filled the kitchen with his winter jacket and neighborly voice that did not fit the cold line of his questions. "You didn't see a police dog come through, did you, Ms. Carter, or a man who might be hurt?" And Laura answered carefully that she had seen nothing but drifted snow. Emily slid her school tablet from her parka, tapped the camera with her thumb, and held it low against the frame to record her pulse in her ears. Shadow tucked himself into the shadow of the pantry, elbows down, eyes fixed on Delaney with the patient stillness of a dog trained to read a room. And when Delaney stepped closer and put 2 fingers toward Laura's shoulder, as if to calm what he had himself stirred, Shadow let a low, firm growl ride the tile, and the lieutenant's hand stopped in the air as if it had reached an invisible fence. Delaney laughed a soft show of charm, eased back half a step, and said he was only checking on folks after the storm. Then he let his eyes drift toward the hallway, as if mapping the floor plan, and Emily kept the lens steady, recording the tone, the angles, the way his boot left a small smear of oil on the linoleum by the mat. He tipped his head, offered a polite warning that the roads would be busy near the ridge, and left with a door click too light to be honest. Laura folded the towel with careful hands to keep them from shaking, and Emily slipped inside to hug her mother, whispering, "We have to keep moving," and showed the short video. Laura watched once, set her jaw, and said, "Take the back fence and go." And she pressed a small first aid tin into Grace's palm, because mothers send what they can when they cannot go. Shadow swept the threshold with his nose, caught Delaney's scent like a string, and pulled toward the tree line with a certainty that asked to be trusted. So Grace and Emily followed him across a patch of snow that held old elk tracks, and then into the firs where the air changed to the faint chemical sweet that did not belong to winter. Shadow slowed, quartered the ground like a searcher, then took a line downwind and broke into a trot until he stopped at a low mound of snow under a fallen spruce. He pawed-nosed, stepped back to huff, and then struck the corner of a green tarp with his muzzle in a deliberate tap, the canine version of pointing. And Emily knelt to brush away the crust, finding the printed county seal ghosting through wear and beneath it. Plastic drum tops tied with twine and flecked with a white powder that clung to her glove when she barely touched it. Grace drew her hand back from the odor and said, "Cutting agents," with the measured voice of someone naming a bird by its flight, then took photos with a camera that lived offline and filled a small sample vial using the edge of a clean card. Shadow circled the site, once paused at a second tarp, and tapped again, revealing 2 more drums stenciled with a transfer code that matched the forest road map Emily had seen on the laptop, and the pattern settled. The last doubt. This was a staging ground hidden under the county's own camouflage. Emily filmed a short sweep on the tablet from tarp to seal to code, to Shadow's alert posture, then slid the device back into her parka and looked at Grace, who had already begun to sketch the best way out. Leave the drums undisturbed. Mark the tree, 2 bends back with a small notch. Only, they would read, return to the barn to copy the footage, to the duplicate drive, and then take the ridge trail above the ranger station to watch from elevation until dusk. Shadow lifted his nose again and tested the wind, as if to say that the station too would bear the same scent, and Emily felt the map inside her align with the map on the screen they had left behind. They withdrew the way they had come, placing their boots in their own prints to keep the snow from telling strangers a new story. And when they reached the fence line, Laura stood on the porch with her coat zipped and a steady look that said she understood more than Emily had said aloud. Emily raised a hand in a small salute that belonged to families who pass strength without fuss, then turned with Grace and Shadow toward the ridge where the station's radio tower cut a thin line against the pale sky. Dusk gathered along the ridge when Grace and Emily slipped back into the barn with Shadow ranging ahead, and they copied the video of the chemical drums to the duplicate drive while the original USB stayed zipped against Emily's chest. Shadow checked. Mark touched his nose to the officer's sleeve, then trotted to the window that faced the service lane and stood rigid ears high as if counting footsteps neither of them could yet hear. Grace locked the roadside door, slid the bar across the creek-side entrance, and nodded to Emily, who took a coil of thin fishing line and a handful of old spoons, washers and bolts from a coffee can, and strung a simple curtain of metal along the window frames, making wind chimes that did not sing unless disturbed. The barn's heater hummed. Mark breathed deeper, and for a heartbeat it felt like preparation might outrun danger. But Shadow shifted, lifted one paw, and gave a low whine. Not fear, only warning that the air had turned. The line of chimes nearest the office window trembled on a breeze that did not reach the other side, and Shadow answered with a second, softer whine that made Grace douse the propane lantern and motion Emily to the interior stall. Tires crackled on frozen gravel, then cut, then restarted with slow rolling that matched men on foot. Grace reached for the flare pen she kept by the door, not to fire but to grip, while Emily pocketed a roll of electrical cable from the workbench because hands needed something ready when plans shifted. The first knock came in a friendly cadence, too loud for courtesy, and Shadow flattened under the windowsill chest, close to boards, eyes fixed as a voice called County Check Power Restoration, the words too smooth and too late for the day's schedule. Grace did not answer, and the second knock turned to the dull thud of a shoulder testing hinges. The wind chime line ticked once, then twice from the far corner, and Shadow's quiet grew into a tight contained growl as he slid along the wall to the creekside door, where a shadow passed the seam. The bar flexed. The screws squealed and the door rattled a third time before a pane cracked near the latch with a careful tap. Grace whispered. Back and Shadow obeyed, but only enough to gather himself. The glass gave a gloved hand, reached in for the lock, and Shadow launched, striking the wrist with a decisive clamp that flattened the hand to the jamb. The man cursed under his breath but could not finish the reach, and Shadow braced, pulled and twisted until the arm gave, and the latch slipped back into place. The pane-shattered boots pounded to the side bay, and the wind chimes there shivered in a hard metal whisper that mapped bodies outside. Grace threw the inner bolt on the side door, then slid to the window and popped the flare to bathe the yard in a wash of red that killed the intruder's night sight. Shadow darted to the office window, tracked a second hand snaking toward a crack, and hit it with the same clean bite, dragging the intruder's forearm onto the sill so Emily could loop the electrical cable twice and cinch it hard against the frame. The man yanked, stumbled, and crashed to the floorboards when Shadow released and shouldered him through the door that finally gave. Grace moved with the speed of a practiced rescuer, twisted the cable into a figure 8 around the man's wrists, and shoved him flat while Emily kicked the fallen hat to the side. The knit cap rolled, the face cleared, and the boyish jawline they both recognized from the school safety talk stared up wide-eyed Deputy Neil Rogers, the officer who had handed out reflective stickers to third graders. The recognition took a breath from the room. Shadow stood over him, teeth bared in a controlled line as footsteps outside retreated to cover and someone hissed an order from the lane. Grace stripped the deputy's radio, switched it off, and pulled his sidearm with a safe, practiced hand, then slid it into the empty grain bin. Emily used the cable's tail to bind the deputy's ankles, checked the knots, and looked to Grace, who nodded once and whispered, "Hold for the next push." Shadow returned to the window, pupils wide, reading the yard like a page, and he gave a single bark toward the fence where the chimes still quivered, drawing Emily's eye to the darker shape of a man crouched by the plow berm. Mark stirred on the table, tried to rise, and Emily pressed his shoulder gently and said, "Stay with me," and he obeyed, eyes on the dog. The men outside conferred, then slipped back toward the lane. Not gone, only regrouping, and the barn settled into a breath of silence that meant the next move would come from distance. Grace leaned close and said, "We will not hold a siege. We move when they slide to the road," and she traced the route in a hush creek to Aldercut to the ranger station's blind wall, while Shadow kept his vigil like a metronome, counting the moment their window would open. The yard lay quiet after the men fell back to the lane, and Grace said, "Now, with the certainty that carries people across thresholds," so Emily steadied the sled. Shadow took point, and they slipped from the barn to the farmhouse for a brief stop to warn Laura. Inside, Grace climbed to the loft where the hardline hung on a peg beside an old Ranger radio, patched the handset to a car battery she kept for outages, and keyed a short burst on a frequency she trusted. The radio crackled and then caught, and she spoke clean and spare location-injured officer evidence retrieved hostile contacts. Probable use of the Ridge station at dusk before giving the call sign she and her cousin's garage used for rescues. Downstairs, Shadow trotted the perimeter nose to the baseboards as if circling the message itself, while Mark lay on the couch with the heater angled to his chest, and Emily checked the straps on his wrists to be sure the padding still protected skin. The lights flickered once and went dark, a silent settling that did not belong to normal outage, and Grace hissed, "Power cut," while the radio choked and then died. Shadow froze, lifted his head and gave 3 short barks followed by 2 long ones, a crisp pattern that snapped Mark awake because it belonged to K9 training channel change, so he pointed to the secondary dial on the Ranger unit and whispered, "Go to 2, and Grace spun the knob, keyed again, and heard a different carrier hum that told her she had landed on a simplex backup. A calm voice answered with the low patience of a federal operator. "Go ahead and..." Grace delivered the distillation USB maps, copied red triangles at the Ridge Station, chemical drums cached north of the creek, hostile uniforms likely compromised, then identified the corrupt signature Lieutenant Frank Delaney, and the voice on the line said he was relaying to Agent Nathan Briggs with priority. Shadow pressed to the door, ears pinned forward, and Emily lifted the curtain to see a county SUV rolling without lights, tires whispering on crust, and Laura stepping onto the porch with her coat open as if to wave a neighbor in. Delaney exited alone, posture, courteous voice, smooth, asking after storm damage. But his eyes ticked past Laura to the dim interior, and when Laura shifted to block the view, he took her elbow lightly and guided her down the steps with a smile that did not touch his eyes. Emily's breath stuttered and then locked into motion. She slid the tablet to record through the crack of the curtain and whispered, "He's taking her." And Mark reached for Shadow's collar and said, "Track," even as he winced. Grace keyed the backup channel again, reported a live grab in progress, and the federal voice answered, "Units inbound. Hold your position if safe," which it was not. Delaney opened the rear door, put Laura in with a soft gesture, and closed it with that careful pressure polite men use when they do not want to leave fingerprints on a moment. The SUV eased away toward the timber cut, and Shadow yanked free of Emily's hand with a clear purpose that needed no words. Emily snapped the porch leash to his collar, not to restrain, but to give him the feel of being sent, and said, "Find her," and the dog launched into the ruts. Nose low, body translating scent into direction. Grace tightened her parka and followed at a distance with Emily at her side, while Mark raised the handset to give Briggs a moving play-by-play vehicle type and direction, the spur road they were taking, the turn at the birch snag until his breath thinned and he had to stop. Shadow drove the line across the creek and up the service road, then cut into the firs where the snow lay clean, and Emily saw the tiny red flecks that began to dot the white at regular intervals, where Shadow's bandaged leg had rubbed raw. Her heart pinched, but she understood what it meant. Trail markers. The dog never intended, but left all the same. Grace called it out. Blood drops on the center line spacing 4 strides, and the federal voice replied, "Copy visual aid acquired which told them helicopters were not coming but ground teams were, and that they would read the land the way Shadow did." The trail bent toward the old industrial yard where a corrugated steel warehouse crouched beside the rail spur, and the wind carried a faint solvent note that matched the drums under the tarp. Emily pulled Shadow to a brief stop at the tree line to let his sides cool and to bind the strip tighter with a clean gauze from Laura's tin, and the dog pressed his forehead to her knee for one breath that felt like consent before he angled his body toward the yard again. Across the road, Delaney's SUV idled behind a stack of pallets and then slid into the warehouse door, yawning just enough to swallow taillights before closing. Emily recorded the last frame timestamp blinking and sent the clip over the backup channel the moment the radio found its carrier again. Agent Briggs came on now himself, voice steady. "Hold position on the tree line 2 minutes out," and Shadow sank into a crouch, eyes on the seam of the big door body, still as stone except for the breath that ghosted the cold. Grace touched Emily's shoulder and said, "We wait for them." Then we go to the door together, and Emily nodded hand on Shadow's ruff as the distant hush of engines grew into the low certainty of help. Agent Nathan Briggs rolled in quiet and low lights, dark engines ticking like restrained muscle, and he let Grace brief him in clipped exact lines the pallets by the spur, the side door seam, the last frame Emily had captured as the warehouse swallowed Delaney's SUV. Briggs knelt to Shadow's level palm out and said, You lead, we follow, and the shepherd took the wind with his nose 5 paces ahead of a staggered file that kept Emily at his shoulder and Mark in the shadow lane where breath would not plume. Twice in the first stretch, Shadow froze and cut 10 feet wide, steering them around air that stung like spent powder. Briggs marked both with a finger and shifted the column without a word. At the corrugated wall, Shadow lifted his muzzle pointed at a knee-high gap where a crate had been dragged to hide a crouch, and Briggs altered the entry to the blind corner Emily had described from childhood memory. The breach was a pry, a wedge, a soft push, and then steel became shadow, and the team flowed in among stacked solvents and strapped boxes. Laura sat bound but upright near a forklift. 2 guards watched the door more than her, which told Briggs they were waiting for confidence to arrive. It arrived as Delaney stepped from behind shrink-wrap jacket, neat voice, even pistol already raised toward Mark in a line that felt personal. The room held one tight beat. Shadow launched from the flank in a low, clean arc, struck Delaney's elbow and spoiled the aim. The shot cracked, shaved the shepherd's shoulder and dented a crate, and Shadow landed with a hitch, clamped the forearm, and yanked the lieutenant to concrete with a practiced torque. Briggs's team poured through that same heartbeat, lights-up commands, steady hands, certain one agent dragging Laura to cover another, cuffing a guard whose hand twitched toward a phone. Delaney tried to twist the gun back into play. Shadow shifted his weight, flattened the wrist, and held until the pistol skittered free. Briggs knelt, snapped a zip tie, and ended the question. 3 more men rose from behind pallets, but training speaks faster than fear knees down. Fingers laced plastic cuffs ratcheting shut, the warehouse lights blooming on at Briggs's order, while a tech began photographing the coded drums that matched the red triangles on the stolen maps. Emily ran the last yards to her mother and worked the knot with shaking but sure fingers. Laura whispered, "You did right." And then she held her daughter long enough to lend back the steadiness she had just received. Grace slid behind a pallet with gauze pressed to the groove on Shadow's shoulder and murmured, "Easy, brave one," while the dog panted through pain and kept his eyes on Mark as if duty itself were a bandage. Medics arrived on the second wave, checked Mark's vitals and Laura's oxygen and Shadow's pulse in the same spare minute, and Briggs read Delaney his rights in a voice that sounded like a door finally closing. Dawn climbed the ridge and spread a gold line along the roof. Outside, tires crunched with the honest noise of help instead of menace. They moved in order. Mark rode with agents to the clinic. Laura, with Grace and Emily and Shadow, in a med van beside a veterinary team Briggs had called from 2 counties over because some rescues required different hands. The surgery proved the graze clean. The stitches lay neat and strong. The shepherd woke to a pale light and found Emily's hand waiting. That afternoon, in a station lobby that smelled of coffee and thaw, Briggs pinned a small badge to a fresh K9 vest service loyalty honor and said only, "For courage that carried us through," and the room answered with the quiet that means respect. Mark, upright and pale, rested his hand on Shadow's neck and said, "Couldn't have done this without you," and Laura squeezed Emily's shoulder, because gratitude sometimes chooses the shortest path. Outside, the wind softened. A single chime down Main Street rang like relief. Emily knelt, pressed her cheek to Shadow's ruff, and whispered, "You're my true hero." And his tail thumped once, not loud, exactly right. There would be statements, chain of custody forms, and winter storms yet to come. But this chapter closed on steady feet. A town spared a mother safe, an officer standing, and a dog whose instincts turned a dark room toward morning. Thanks for staying with the story all the way to Timberline's dawn. If this pulled you in, tap like and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I'd love your take in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The cedar note that said, "Keep quiet." Shadow pointing to the hidden USB. The wind chime warning at the barn, or the warehouse standoff at the rail spur. Who's your favorite character right now? Emily, Shadow, Grace, or Mark, and why? What do you think still lurks on those Forest Service roads after dark? Tell me where you're watching from so we can see how far this trail runs. Drop your city and country and add one detail you want to explore next. The ranger station's paper trail, Delaney's network, or Emily's first day back at school after all this. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. New episodes and behind-the-scenes breakdowns are coming soon. Your comments help decide what we follow next.